Hello and welcome to yet another discussion on literatures in English. In our last meeting, we discussed broadly on what literature is, and we arrived at the fact that literature has three main genres, which are prose, represented by the novel and short stories, drama, represented by plays and sketches, and lastly, poetry, which is represented by poems and rhymes. Today, we're going to move a little forward to look at one of the genres of literature known as prose. Prose in itself deals with the tradition of the old, that is, in the days of old, our parents used to tell stories, because prose has to do with the narrative. They used to tell stories of old, legends, myths, to us young children around the fireside, especially during the rainy seasons when we just came back from the farm. But today, prose has moved beyond the old tradition to what we call newness, recent trends, what is happening today and affecting our societies. So it has to do with the novel or novels and short stories. It should be noted that prose deals specifically with storytelling, the narrative. When you want to tell the story through literature, then prose is that genre, that branch of literature that will better convey the kind of message that you want to pass across. If you look at the diagram, it illustrates all of these things that we have already discussed about the prose genre or the narrative. Now, let's look at the characteristics of the narrative or of the genre of literature known as prose. Every genre, like we said in the last class, has its peculiarities and is unique in itself. Therefore, it will obviously have specific characteristics that make prose what it is, or that makes prose, or that make prose different from the other genres of literature. Let us go ahead and see what these characteristics are. Firstly, it should be noted that prose or the narrative draws inspiration from social and historical happenings. That is, what happens in the society in our everyday context could be reproduced and communicated back to society in view of shaping it. Remember that we did say that literature serves as a functional tool in that it aims at changing society for positive reasons. Writers of prose or the narrative are keen observers of our society. If the first point talks about drawing inspiration from social and historical happenings, then it therefore means that a writer must be that person who is keen to the happenings of our daily experiences, so that these can be transformed and communicated through their works of art. Again, learners in the narrative, writers must know that they have to get to understand, that is, learners of prose or of literature in general, get to know about different cultural settings and behaviors, because literature doesn't limit itself to only one society. It cuts across boundaries, it cuts across continents, it cuts across notions, philosophies, ideologies, and much more. So that is what literature can do through the narrative. The narrative or the novel also helps us to build our grammar and vocabulary power. Interesting, isn't it? You know, when through your reading of a novel, you get to learn new words. You get to understand the meaning of the words if you check them out in your dictionaries, and then you get to use those words. When you use them somewhere, it is clear that people will know that for sure you are someone who has mastered all of this. It must be highlighted at this point in time that the narrative as a genre can best be studied following the elements of the novel. And these elements, like we did say in our last discussion, vary according to the genres in question. So today, as we look at prose, it is obvious that some of these elements would be the same as that which we saw under literature, but we shall discuss them with specific attention drawn or put or laid, or emphasis will be given specifically to the novel. Let us now go ahead and look at what the elements of the novel or the narrative are all about. The very first point is the plot. When the writer sits and imagines, observes the society, and wants to pass across a message out there, there is, first of all, a vision of that story. The writer thinks of how that story will be developed from beginning to the end. The writer thinks of so many things that will be involved in the story. And the term that, the umbrella term that is often given when we are talking about that story, that vision, that whole narrative which a writer wants to come up with is called the plot. So the plot is the very first and very, very, very relevant element of the novel. When we talk about plot, many things come to mind. Remember that words may mean different things. The same word plot could mean planning to kill somebody or planning something without the knowledge of another. But here plot is used as a noun to refer to that element of the novel that speaks of the order of events. That is how the events occur in the story. It also has to do with the sequence of actions, or what we call the progression of incidents. That is, the plot causes us as readers of the novel or the narrative to know when it begins, how it flows from beginning to the end. This chronological movement of a story, which is reflected in the story's plot, helps us to master the story from the very beginning right to the end. And it is important in the sense that it helps students or learners of literature to understand the spot or the junction at which something specific happens in the story. Without the plot, the novel cannot be realized. As already said, you begin with the story that you want to tell, and that story must be creatively presented through a meticulous projection. When dealing with plot, many stories should come to your mind. Particularly, take note of these questions. What is the story all about? That is what plot seems to be asking. Who does what, where, when, and why also comes in to tell that which plot demands. Another question could be, where does the story begin and how does it end? That has to do with the chronological ordering of the story. Another question that should come to your minds as you study the plot of the narrative is, how many plot levels do we have? Some narratives have multiple plots, that is more than one, while others have a main and a subplot. It all depends on the style or the approach which a writer wants to take. Having thought about the plot or talked or discussed about the plot, the next thing that comes to mind is characterization. That is the second most important element of the novel. When a writer observes society and comes up with what he wants to tell, the next thing is, how would that story be told? And for a story to be told in a way that will be understood by those who read that story, it is important that persons, characters be brought in who have the right frame of mind, the right kind of attitude, and the right kind of social interaction that will enable the story to be told or to be read and understood well. Characterization deals with human beings as well as animals or even things. Things may play the role of a character depending on what they set out to be. As we see on the diagram on the board, characterization deals with persons, animals, behavior, interaction, and much more. Just like we saw on the plot, you must want to ask yourself this question: or some of these questions in order to have a clear dissection of what characterization is all about. The first question goes, who are those found in the story? Those found in the story could be persons, could be animals, could be behavior, we could find traits of people, we could see human interactions of various kinds. Remember that we are drawing inspiration from the novel Animal Farm by George Orwell. In terms of characterization in the discourse of the narrative of Animal Farm, George Orwell, who comes from Britain, uses both human and animal characters to show different behaviors and interactive mediums in his story. So when we ask ourselves the question, who are those found in the story? The answer will be, in that story, Animal Farm, we find persons, we find animals, we see different behaviors, and we see different levels of interaction. That is what characterization does to the novel. The next question comes, what do the characters think about one another? It is very important that a writer, when using characters, has to bring in characters who will be able to interact well enough to convey the kind of messages, the kind of subject matter which that story sets out to convey. So, what do they think about themselves? In the novel Animal Farm, the animals think differently about themselves. Likewise, the humans. Mr. Jones thinks he is right for treating animals wrongly, but Frederick and the others like Bickerton think that he is the cause for his eviction from the animal farm after the rebellion. Another question could be, what can you as an individual, that is someone who reads that novel or that story, what can you say about the individual behaviors of the characters? Here we will discover that some characters are good, while others are average, while others are bad. And whatever attribute the characters have, it is clear that it is simply because they are existing in those stories to achieve a particular objective. How do they each help us as readers and learners of literature to understand the stories better? Through characters, that is through the study of characterization, through the study of plot, an easy enhancement of understanding could be gotten. Then, most especially, we have to always ask ourselves the question, are the characters minor or major characters? Are they round or flat, so to speak? Round characters are those characters who are very, very active in the story. That is, they are major characters. Examples here include characters like the main characters in most novels or short stories that you have written. Looking at the text on the study, we would discover that most of the animals, especially the pigs, like Snowball, like Napoleon, Squealer, and the others, could be likened to major characters in the Animal Farm when it comes to the animal characters. And Mr. Jones, his wife, Frederick, and others are those characters who are also very active in the story and who are humans. So once a character is round, you see that character everywhere. It seems that the story centers on that character. When a character is flat, on the other hand, you discover that you hardly hear about the character. In the story Animal Farm, we discover that one of the animals disappears from the farm, and we hear nothing about that animal. Guess what? Who that animal is? Tit for tat. Examples, again, like we have said, human characters, they include Mr. Jones and the family. We have Mr. Frederick, we have Bickerton, we have Whymper, who is the intermediary between humans and animals. That is the farm itself and the human world. So these are all human characters who are found in the text. When you now go to the animals, like I was saying a while ago, we have Napoleon, we have Boxer, we have Squealer, we have Benjamin, all majorly philosopher, animal character. We have Snowball, the very industrious character. We have Moses and many others. These are all animal characters found in the text. When we move away from the characters or characterization, the next element that comes to mind is the setting of the story. Here from the diagram on the board, we discover that setting could be psychological, it could be physical, as well as historical. The setting could be in terms of the time when the story was written, that is the period. It could be a period in history, it could be a period in religion, it could be some fact that took place, some idea, some happening, some event that occurred at a given time in question. That setting could be psychological, means the place where the story is told could be in the mind. That is, a writer could cause every reader of a story to journey into the world of the story and feel the emotions that the characters go through and react positively or negatively depending on what that is for him or her. By physical setting, we mean the place, the physical environment where the story is told. Animal Farm, for instance, as a case study, is told in a farm. And we have other farms. But then, what makes Animal Farm different from the other farms is that man begins controlling Animal Farm, then man is later sent out of the farm, animals take over the control of the farm, and before the novel runs to an end, we discover that man has to come back to occupy what was originally his. When studying setting, we need to ask ourselves many questions again. Where is the story told? That is in terms of place, physical environment. It could be set in Douala, it could be set in Yaoundé, it could be set in England like Animal Farm. Another thing is, when was the story written? That is the historical setting of the story. The historical setting helps learners of literature to understand the story better. This is because for you to understand a story, you need to go to the background of that story and understand it, from that backdrop. That is, you need to know that, for instance, if a story was written in the 1970s, you will be able to situate the historical context within which the story was written. And when you look at it from that perspective, many things will come to your mind. Again, you could ask yourself this question: how does the period of the writing affect us today? Literature knows no bound as a subject. Literature cuts across boundaries, cuts across historical periods. Therefore, if we read novels that were written 10 years ago today, it simply means that those stories still have some relevant role to play in our today's world. An example here, when we look at Animal Farm as a story, we discover that it is told in a plantation or a farm. It reflects a period in itself. It reflects a period in history. That period could be assumed from those who have read the story, they think that it pictures the Russian Revolution. That was a period in history when Russia as a country went through hitches. It also pictures, as a story, Animal Farm also pictures the Industrial Revolution. The windmill which the animals set up is an iota or an element of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, to recapitulate, is that period in history when there was a shift from manual labor to machine work. It also situates itself within that setting which speaks of the quest for supremacy in Europe. Lastly, the story, like many other stories, appeals to our human and psychological consciences. That is the setting of the story Animal Farm. We'll move away from the setting to talk about themes. Like we said before, when a writer sets out to tell a story through a narrative, that story must have a main subject matter. And under subject matter, many things could be looked at. The theme or thematic concerns have to do with messages that are conveyed in the story. It also has to do with main ideas that we find in the story. What is it that the writer wants to pass across as a message? What are the ideas that he brings forth or that he projects? Are there issues raised in the story? What are the projected points which the writer wants us as readers or learners of literature to take home? Like the tradition holds in our lesson, we want to look at some of those questions that should come to our mind as we look at themes with respect to the narrative. The first question is, what is the subject matter? That is the subject matter of the story, the main point, the main focus. What is the story all about? The story of Animal Farm speaks of animals who are under humans and are no longer satisfied with the deteriorating and the torturing situations which they go through. And as such, they decide to send man away from the farm and claim over the control of the farm and ownership as well. What are other issues raised? Many other things are said in The Animal Farm by George Orwell. We have issues of administration, we have issues that relate to many other things. Another question that you can ask is, what is your opinion about the subject matter or the issues that are raised? George Orwell, as a writer, may have some things that he wants to talk about. The question is, you as a learner or a reader of a story, after discovering these things for yourself, do you agree with the things that he says? That is, like we said before, the story appeals to the human and social consciences. So, do you agree with some of the things that the writer says? If yes, how and why? Example here, we would see that for themes, many things will come to play. The story Animal Farm is a fable. A fable is an animal story, but it is clear that George Orwell uses animals to speak about real behaviors, real experiences that humans go through. Therefore, issues or themes like love, murder, hatred, war, power struggle, rivalry, death, escape, and much more could be found in the story Animal Farm. The question now is, how do these themes help us to better understand the raison d'etre or the rationale for which George Orwell set out to write? Having looked at thematic concerns, we will now go over to style. By style, we mean language, we mean stylistic devices or literary devices, we mean point of view. And again, we have narrative techniques. What do we mean when we talk about language? By language, we mean the level of the language. Is it high? Is it low? By style, we want to look at figures of speech, that which makes a writer unique. For instance, George Orwell uses personification, he uses imagery, he uses humor, and he uses many other devices that help us understand the story better. By point of view, we mean the angle from which a writer stands before telling a story. By narrative technique, when telling a story, there are different ways of presenting that story. You could decide to use flashback when you want to take the reader back to something that has happened in the past. You could digress or use digression to bring in some other thing which you want maybe to cause some emotional relief for the reader. Lastly, you have suspense. You could tell a story in a way that whenever you stop telling the story, those listening or reading that story want to know more about what happens next. Another very important element which must be discussed under the narrative has to do with lessons learned. By lessons learned, We mean that after reading a story, do you just come out blank? As you read the story or the story Animal Farm, do you find moral or social lessons? Do you find academic or educational lessons? Again, are those lessons silently psychological or are they transformational in nature? It is important that one of the reasons for which writers write is simply because they cannot go out there and meet every individual in the society to tell their story. But then they use literature through the narrative to pass across messages, to teach lessons, societal lessons, in order to transform society positively. It is clear that this lesson set out to dissect or to unravel, or better still, unveil the mystery behind the novel or the narrative. And I strongly believe that if we view the narrative or the novel, or short stories, better still, using or following these elaborated elements, we will surely be able to understand every novel or short story that we lay our hands on. Therefore, you must look at the narrative and remember that those are the things that entail. And until our next meeting, it has been your regular literature in English companion. Say bye or goodbye from this end and wishing you the best until we meet again. Thanks.